The war horn had barely stopped echoing across the stone towers when General Garrick Holt slammed his fist against the council table and demanded to know where his king had gone. Every chair in the war room was filled, except one. Maps of the northern border were spread across the table, marked with red ink where enemy scouts had been spotted 3 nights running. The commanders of the Ashworth Pack sat rigid, waiting for their king to arrive and give the order that would decide whether they marched to war or waited another season. But the seat at the head of the table remained empty, and the silence stretching through the hall was heavier than any argument could have been. "This is the 4th meeting he has missed this month," Garrick said, his voice low and dangerous. "A king who does not show up for his own war council is a king who invites his enemies to strike." Beside him, Lady Iris Vane sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her knuckles had gone pale. She was betrothed to King Cain Ashworth, a match arranged to end decades of hostility between 2 powerful packs. Her family had sent her here to secure peace through marriage, not to be humiliated by a king who could not be bothered to sit through his own meetings. "Perhaps he is unwell," she offered, though her tone carried no real belief in the excuse. "He was seen this morning," said Edmund Ashworth, the king's younger brother, standing near the window with his arms crossed. Edmund had spent his whole life shadowing his brother, learning the weight of leadership from a distance, always ready to step in, but never once needing to. Until now. He looked healthy enough. He simply walked past the hall and kept walking. Garrick turned to him sharply. "Then where does he go, Edmund? You are his blood. Surely you know something the rest of us do not." Edmund's jaw tightened. He did not answer right away, because the truth was, he did not know. His brother had always been steady, predictable, a man who valued duty above every comfort. The Cain Ashworth that Edmund had grown up with would never abandon a war council while enemy scouts prowled the border. Something had shifted in him these past weeks, and Edmund could not name what it was. Outside the castle walls, far from the shouting and the maps and the mounting suspicion, Cain Ashworth walked toward the stables, with his hands in his pockets, and his shoulders lighter than they had been in years. He knew what waited for him in that council room. He knew the accusations that would follow him for the rest of the day, the whispers that would spread through the halls by nightfall, the questions his brother would ask with quiet, worried eyes. He knew all of it, and still his feet carried him away from duty, and toward the one place in his kingdom where no one looked at him like a king. The stable smelled of hay and leather, and the particular mixture of dust and animal warmth that had comforted Cain since he was a boy hiding from his father's temper. He pushed open the wooden door and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the high windows. A figure knelt near the far stall, brushing down a black mare with slow, careful strokes. The stable hand did not turn around, did not offer the bow or the nervous greeting that every other person in the kingdom gave him. This one simply kept brushing, as though the arrival of the Alpha King meant nothing at all. "You missed another meeting," the stable hand said without looking up. The voice was quiet, careful, pitched low, though something in it always struck Cain as strange, a note he could never quite place. "I am aware," Cain said, leaning against the wooden post at the entrance of the stall. "Your general will be furious. He already is." The stable hand finally turned, revealing a face marked by old scars along one cheek and jaw, framed by short hair the color of wet sand. The eyes, though, were the sharpest thing about this stable hand, gray and quick, missing nothing. Wren had worked in the royal stables for nearly a year, arriving quiet and unannounced, asking only for food and shelter in exchange for labor. No family had come looking. No papers had been filed. Wren simply appeared one autumn evening with a limp and a haunted look, and somehow, without anyone quite deciding it, became part of the castle grounds. "You should not be here," Wren said, setting down the brush. "Not when your kingdom needs you elsewhere." "My kingdom needs me to make a decision about war," Cain said, "and I already know what I am going to decide. Coming here does not change the outcome. It only gives me a few minutes of quiet before I have to become the king again." Wren studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that most people in the castle were too afraid to give their ruler. There was no fear in those gray eyes, only a careful, guarded curiosity, as if Wren was trying to solve a puzzle that had not yet revealed all its pieces. "You talk like being king is a costume," Wren said. "Some days it feels like one." "Then you are lucky. Most people never get to take off the parts of themselves that hurt." Cain tilted his head, studying the stable hand with new interest. There was something underneath those words, something old and bruised, but Ren did not elaborate, and Cain had learned in the past months not to push. Whatever secrets lived behind that scarred face were not his to demand, not yet. He had asked once, gently, about the scars, and the stable hand had gone so silent and so still that Cain feared he had broken something fragile. He had not asked again. Instead, he crossed the stall and picked up a second brush, running it along the mare's flank, in long, even strokes, matching the rhythm Ren had already set. For a while, neither of them spoke. The mare shifted her weight and huffed softly, and somewhere above them a bird settled into the rafters, and the sounds of the kingdom's council chamber, the shouting and the accusations, felt very far away. "They will send someone looking for you," Ren said eventually. "They always do. Let them look. You are the king. You cannot simply disappear." "I am not disappearing," Cain said. "I am standing right here, doing something with my hands that does not involve deciding how many people will die this season. Is that so difficult to understand?" Ren's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind those gray eyes. "No," Ren said quietly. "I understand it better than you know." Before Cain could ask what that meant, the stable door creaked open, and both of them turned sharply toward the sound. Edmund stood in the doorway, breathing hard, as though he had run the entire distance from the castle. "There you are," Edmund said, relief and frustration warring in his voice. "Garrick is threatening to send riders out to search the countryside. Iris is convinced you have been kidnapped or worse. Do you have any idea what it looks like when the king vanishes during a war council?" Cain set down the brush slowly, aware of Ren stepping back into the shadows of the stall, putting distance between them without seeming to move at all. It was a skill Cain had noticed before, the way Ren could fade into a room, becoming background, becoming furniture, becoming nothing worth a second glance. "I needed air," Cain said simply. Edmund's eyes moved past his brother, landing on the stable hand still holding the brush in the corner. Something crossed his face, curiosity or suspicion. Cain could not tell which, but it vanished quickly beneath his obvious relief at finding his brother unharmed. "You cannot keep doing this," Edmund said, lowering his voice. "Every time you vanish, it makes you look weak in front of the council, and weakness in front of the council makes its way to our enemies within days. You know how quickly rumors travel." "I know," Cain said. "Then why do you keep coming here?" Cain did not have an answer he was willing to give, not with Ren standing close enough to hear every word, not with his own understanding of the pull still incomplete. He only knew that something about the quiet of the stable, and the steady, guarded presence of the stable hand, who never once looked at him with fear or flattery, had become something he needed, the way a starving man needs bread. "I will come back," Cain said instead. "Give me a moment to finish here." Edmund hesitated, clearly wanting to argue further, but something in his brother's face made him stop. He nodded once, sharp and reluctant, and stepped back out into the courtyard, leaving the stable door open behind him. Cain turned back to Ren, who had gone very still, gray eyes fixed on some point past his shoulder. "You should go," Ren said softly, "before they start asking why the king spends so much time with a stable hand. Let them ask. You say that now. You will not say it when the questions turn dangerous." Cain frowned at the strange weight behind those words, the certainty in them, as though Ren had lived through exactly this kind of danger before, and knew precisely how it ended. He wanted to ask, wanted to press further into the mystery standing in front of him, but the sound of hurried footsteps outside the stable told him his time had run out. "Tomorrow," Cain said, already moving toward the door. Ren did not answer, only watched him go with an expression that Cain could not read, something between longing and fear, gone the moment he blinked. Before he left the stable that morning, Cain lingered a moment longer than he intended, watching Ren move around the mare with quiet efficiency, checking her hooves, running a hand along her neck to calm her. There was a gentleness in those movements that seemed at odds with the wariness in Ren's eyes, as though tenderness and suspicion had learned to live together in the same body, out of necessity rather than choice. "How long have you worked here now?" Cain asked, though he already knew the answer. He had asked before, more than once, testing whether the story would ever change. "Almost a year," Ren said, not looking up. "You know that already. I like hearing you say it. Why?" Because it is one of the few true things you have ever told me. Ren's hands stilled on the mare's flank for the briefest moment, so brief that Cain almost missed it, and then the motion resumed as though nothing had happened. You assume the rest is false. I assume the rest is incomplete, Cain said. There is a difference. Is there? A lie hides what happened. An incomplete truth simply waits for the right moment to be finished. Ren finally looked at him then, gray eyes sharp and searching, as though trying to determine whether the king in front of them was clever or simply hopeful. You think too much for a man who is supposed to be planning a war. Perhaps that is why I come here, to think about something other than war. A horse in the next stall stamped its foot loudly, breaking the moment, and Ren turned away to check on it, grateful, it seemed, for the interruption. Cain did not press further, though the questions sat heavy in his chest, questions about the scars along Ren's jaw, about the way certain words made those gray eyes flicker with old pain, about why a person with clearly some education and bearing chose to live in silence among horses rather than seek a life among people of standing. He thought of these questions the entire walk back toward the castle, turning them over like stones in his palm, searching for the shape hidden beneath the surface. Whatever answers existed, they were not ready to be given, and Cain found himself strangely patient with that fact, willing to wait, willing to keep returning to the stable, day after day, until the walls Ren had built finally allowed him past the first gate. By the time Cain reached the War Council chamber, the room had fallen into a tense, simmering quiet. Garrick's fury had cooled into something colder and more calculating. Iris watched her betrothed with narrowed eyes, searching his face for some sign of where he had been. Edmund stood near the window, arms crossed, saying nothing, though his gaze kept drifting toward his brother with quiet, unspoken questions. Cain took his seat at the head of the table and forced his attention onto the maps, onto the red ink marking enemy movement along the border, onto the decision that could no longer be delayed. He gave the order to prepare the northern defenses, watched his commanders nod and disperse to carry out his will, and felt the whole time as though part of him remained back in that stable, brushing down a mare beside a stranger, whose secrets grew heavier with every passing day. That night, long after the castle had gone quiet, Cain stood at his window and looked out over the dark shape of the stables at the edge of the grounds. A single lantern glowed faintly from within, and he wondered, not for the first time, what exactly he was doing, and why a stable hand with old scars and guarded eyes had become the only person in his kingdom who made him feel like more than a crown. He did not yet know that the woman hiding behind that quiet, careful disguise carried a secret large enough to shake his entire kingdom to its foundations. He only knew that tomorrow, War Council or not, his feet would carry him back to that same stable door, drawn by something he could not name and was not yet ready to question. The bucket of water slipped from Ren's hands the moment a shadow fell across the stable door, and the sound of it clattering against the stone floor echoed louder than it should have in the early morning quiet. Ren froze, heart hammering, before realizing it was only one of the younger stable boys, a lanky teenager named Colin, who worked the morning shift feeding the horses before the sun fully rose. Colin gave a sleepy nod and shuffled past toward the feed room, unaware of the way his presence had nearly stopped Ren's heart. It happened like this most mornings, a sudden noise, an unexpected shadow, a door opening faster than expected, and every time, Ren's body reacted before the mind could catch up, bracing for danger that, so far, had not come. Old habits did not fade easily. Not after everything that had happened. Ren bent down to gather the spilled water, wiping hands dry on a worn tunic several sizes too large, chosen specifically because it hid the shape of a body that would otherwise draw questions. The disguise had become so practiced over the past year that most days Ren barely thought about it anymore. The careful binding beneath the shirt, the short hair cut with a blunt knife, the low, guarded voice pitched to sound like a young man rather than the woman underneath. It was a costume worn so long it had started to feel like skin. The other stable hands knew Ren only as quiet, competent, and unwilling to talk about the past. They had learned not to ask questions after the first few attempts were met, with silence so heavy it discouraged further conversation. Ren preferred it that way. Questions led to answers, and answers led to danger, and danger was the one thing Ren had sworn never to invite again. By mid-morning, the stable had filled with the usual sounds of the working day, hooves striking stone, the creak of leather tack, the low murmur of stable hands, calling instructions to one another, as horses were readied for the castle guard. Wren moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, mucking stalls, checking hooves for stones, brushing coats until they gleamed, all while keeping half an ear tuned toward the courtyard beyond the stable doors, alert to any unfamiliar voice or unexpected visitor. It was nearly noon when Cain arrived again, slipping through the side entrance the way he always did, dressed in a simple tunic that stripped away every marker of his rank except the quiet authority in the way he carried himself. Wren had noticed early on that even without his crown, even in plain clothes, there was something about him that made the horses settle and the other stable hands instinctively straighten their backs, as though royalty lived in his bones rather than his clothing. "You came again," Wren said, not bothering to hide the note of surprise. 2 days in a row was unusual, even for him. "I told you I would. You tell me many things." Cain huffed something close to a laugh, low and warm, and settled onto an overturned crate near the stall where Wren was working. "Careful." That almost sounded like an accusation. Perhaps it was. "Then I will simply have to prove myself trustworthy." Wren glanced at him sideways, unable to stop the small, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of a mouth that rarely smiled at all. There was something dangerously easy about the way conversation flowed between them, something that made the careful walls Wren had built over the past year feel thinner than they should. "Your general came looking for you again this morning," Wren said, changing the subject before the moment could grow too comfortable. He stood at the stable entrance for a long while, watching. Cain's expression sharpened. "Garrick? Here?" He did not come inside, just watched. Then he left. That is not like him. Perhaps he suspects something. "There is nothing to suspect," Cain said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely convinced of his own words. Wren said nothing further, focusing instead on the buckle of a saddle that did not actually need adjusting, using the task as an excuse to look away from the king's searching gaze. The truth was, there was something to suspect, though not in the way Garrick likely imagined. No spying, no sabotage, nothing so simple as betrayal. Only a woman, hiding inside a disguise that grew more dangerous to maintain, with every hour Cain spent watching too closely. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication. One of the war horses, a temperamental stallion named Pharaoh, had grown skittish after a loud crash of thunder rolled across the hills, and by the time Wren reached his stall, he had already kicked through part of the wooden partition, sending splinters flying and startling the horses in the neighboring stalls into a chorus of frightened whinnies. "Easy," Wren murmured, slipping into the stall with slow, careful movements, hands raised, voice pitched low and steady, despite the danger of the stallion's flailing hooves. "Easy now. No one is going to hurt you." Pharaoh reared, eyes wide and white-rimmed with fear, and Wren pressed back against the wall to avoid the crashing hooves, heart pounding, focused entirely on calming the animal, rather than any thought of personal safety. It took several long minutes, murmured words and careful, patient movement, before the stallion's breathing slowed, and his ears came forward, instead of pinned flat against his skull. Cain had appeared at the stall door at some point during the commotion, watching with visible tension, hand gripping the wooden frame, as though ready to intervene the moment danger grew too great. When Pharaoh finally settled, nostrils still flaring but no longer thrashing, Cain let out a breath he had clearly been holding. "That was reckless," he said, voice rough with something that sounded almost like fear. "That was my job," Wren answered, running a hand along the stallion's neck. "You could have been hurt. I was not. That is not the same as saying you could not have been." Wren turned to look at him then, surprised by the sharpness of his concern, by the way his jaw had tightened, and his shoulders had gone rigid during the entire ordeal. It was not the reaction of a king mildly interested in the well-being of a stable hand. It was something closer to fear, real and immediate, the kind that came from caring more than one intended to. "You worry too much," Wren said softly. "Perhaps I have reason to." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for, and for a moment neither spoke, the stable falling quiet, except for Pharaoh's settling breath and the distant sound of rain beginning to fall against the roof. It was in that stillness, in that unexpected quiet, that Wren's sleeve caught against a splintered edge of the broken partition, tearing the fabric along the forearm, and revealing, for just a heartbeat, the edge of a faded scar unlike the ones on Ren's face. A long, thin line that spoke of a blade, rather than an accident, running from wrist toward elbow, in a pattern too deliberate to be anything but the mark of a fight, or an execution attempt survived by nothing but luck. Ren yanked the sleeve back down immediately, but not fast enough. Kane's eyes had already caught the mark, and something shifted in his expression, curiosity deepening into concern, concern sharpening into something closer to recognition, as though a piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for months had just clicked faintly into place. "Ren," he said quietly, "it is nothing. That is not the kind of scar that comes from nothing." Ren stepped back, putting distance between them, arms crossing instinctively over the torn sleeve, as though the gesture alone could undo what had already been seen. "Everyone in this kingdom has scars, my king. Some are simply easier to hide than others." "I am not asking to shame you," Kane said gently, taking a careful step forward, hands open at his sides in a gesture meant to soothe rather than threaten. "I am asking because I want to understand. Some things are not meant to be understood. They are only meant to be survived." The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming steadily against the stable roof, and somewhere in the depths of the building, a horse shifted restlessly in its stall. Ren stood very still, breathing carefully, aware of how close this moment had come to unraveling everything, aware that one more question, one more careful, probing look, might have been enough to bring the entire disguise crashing down. He simply nodded, slow and thoughtful, and let the silence stretch between them until it softened into something less dangerous. "Then I will not ask again," he said. "Not until you are ready to tell me. That may never happen. Then I will wait." Ren studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the flattery or performance that usually accompanied such promises from powerful men, and finding, instead, only quiet sincerity. It frightened Ren more than any threat could have. Threats were familiar. Kindness, real and patient, was something Ren had learned long ago not to trust, because kindness, given by the powerful, so often came with a price attached, revealed only once it was too late to refuse it. "You should go," Ren said finally. "Before the rain traps you here and gives your council one more reason to worry." Kane lingered a moment longer, gaze steady, before finally turning toward the door. He paused there, one hand against the frame, and looked back. "For what it is worth," he said, "whatever you are hiding, I do not think it makes you dangerous. I think it makes you careful." He left before Ren could answer, disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken things. Ren sank down onto the overturned crate Kane had vacated only minutes before, staring at the torn sleeve, at the scar now fully exposed to the dim afternoon light, and felt, for the first time in nearly a year, the fragile edges of the disguise beginning to fray. Later that evening, once the rain had passed and the last of the horses had been settled for the night, Ren sat alone in the small loft above the stable that served as sleeping quarters, mending the torn sleeve by the light of a single candle. The needle moved slowly, carefully, each stitch a small act of repair, for a wound that ran far deeper than the fabric itself. A knock at the loft ladder startled the needle from Ren's fingers. Colin's voice called up from below, hesitant and apologetic. "Sorry to bother you. Just wanted to check you were all right. Heard about Pharaoh kicking through the stall." "I am fine," Ren called back, voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at every limb. "The king seemed worried," Colin added, a note of curiosity creeping into his tone. "Waited outside a long while after you calmed him down." Ren's hands stilled over the mending. "Did he say anything?" "Just asked if you needed a healer. I told him you never take help from anyone, not even when you probably should." Colin's laugh drifted up through the floorboards, easy, and unaware of the weight behind his words. "You are a strange one, you know that? Most stable hands would jump at the chance to have the king fussing over them. I am not most stable hands." "No," Colin agreed. "You certainly are not." A pause followed, and then, gentler, "Good night then. Shout if you need anything." His footsteps faded back toward his own corner of the stable, and Ren sat alone again in the candlelight, listening to the settling sounds of the horses below, the soft shuffle of hooves against straw, the occasional low nicker passing between stalls. It was a peaceful sound, one that had become as familiar as breathing over the past year, and yet tonight it did nothing to ease the tightness gathered behind Ren's ribs. Kane had seen the scar. Not all of it. not enough to understand its full story, but enough to know it was not the mark of some ordinary accident. He had asked the right question in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, and though he had been gracious enough to let the matter rest, Ren understood with painful clarity that kings did not simply let mysteries lie forgotten. Curiosity, especially the patient, careful kind that Cain possessed, had a way of circling back when least expected. Ren set down the mending and reached beneath the thin straw mattress, fingers finding the small wooden box hidden there, worn smooth from a year of nervous handling. Inside lay the only remaining pieces of a life left behind: a stitched cloth bearing a family crest long since declared extinct, a ring too dangerous to wear, and a folded letter, written in a hand that would never write again. It was enough simply to know it was there, proof that the person hiding inside this disguise had once been someone else entirely, someone with a name that could never again be spoken aloud within these castle walls. The candle burned low, and Ren finally closed the box, sliding it back beneath the mattress, and lay staring up at the dark wooden beams of the loft ceiling. Sleep did not come easily. It rarely did anymore. Not since the night everything had been taken. Not since the fire and the screaming and the desperate flight across 3 kingdoms that had ended, improbably, in the stables of the very pack whose alliance might one day be turned against the enemies still hunting for survivors. Cain's face kept returning uninvited to Ren's thoughts, the concern in his eyes when Pharaoh had reared, the careful gentleness in his voice when he had promised not to ask again. It would have been easier, Ren thought, if he had been cruel, or careless, or indifferent. It would have been so much easier to keep the walls standing if the man on the other side of them had given any reason at all to distrust him. Instead, he had given kindness, patient and unearned, and kindness was the one weapon Ren had never learned how to defend against. It would not hold much longer. Ren had always known that. What Ren had not expected was how much it would hurt to imagine it finally falling away. Smoke filled the eastern stable before anyone realized the lantern hanging near the hay stores had tipped and caught the dry straw beneath it, and by the time the first shout of alarm rang across the courtyard, flames had already begun climbing the wooden support beams with terrifying speed. Ren woke to the smell of burning straw and the panicked screaming of horses trapped in their stalls. There was no time to think. No time to grab a cloak or check the loft ladder for safety. Ren dropped straight down into the smoke-filled stable below, coughing immediately against the thick gray haze, and moved on instinct toward the stalls where the horses thrashed against their doors, eyes wild with terror. "Move! Move! Get them out!" Ren shouted, voice raw, throwing open the first latch and driving a mare out into the courtyard with a firm slap against her flank. Colin appeared moments later, face pale with fear, working the opposite row of stalls, and together they fought through smoke and heat and the deafening chorus of panicked animals, freeing horse after horse into the night air. By the time the castle guard arrived with buckets and shouted orders, most of the animals had already been freed, though the fire had grown large enough to threaten the entire structure, orange light flickering high against the dark sky, sparks rising like small dying stars into the smoke above. Cain arrived at a dead run, having been woken by the commotion, still dressed only in a loose shirt and trousers, hair disheveled from sleep. His eyes found Ren immediately among the chaos, soot-streaked and coughing, pulling the last frightened colt from its stall as a support beam groaned dangerously overhead. "Get out of there," Cain shouted, already moving toward the stable entrance, despite the guards trying to hold him back. A king did not belong inside a burning building, and every instinct in the guards screamed at them to stop him, but Cain pushed past regardless, driven by something faster and more urgent than reason. Ren emerged just as the beam finally gave way behind, crashing down in a shower of sparks and burning straw, close enough that the heat scorched the back of a tunic, already torn and filthy from the night's work. Cain caught Ren by the shoulders, pulling hard, dragging them both several steps back from the collapsing structure, before either of them fully registered what had happened. "You could have died," Cain said, breathing hard, hands still gripping Ren's shoulders, as though unwilling to let go now that danger had passed. "So could you," Ren shot back, equally breathless. "You should not have come inside. Neither should you. It is my job. It is not your job to die for horses." The argument might have continued, except that in the chaos of the rescue, in the desperate pulling and shoving through smoke, the collar of Ren's shirt had torn loose at the shoulder, and the strip of fabric bound tightly beneath it had slipped just enough to reveal, in the flickering firelight, the unmistakable curve that no amount of loose clothing could fully disguise. Kane's eyes dropped to the exposed collarbone, and for a long, suspended moment, understanding moved across his face slowly, like a sunrise breaking through fog. Ren felt it happen, felt the exact instant the puzzle completed itself in his mind, and every muscle went rigid with a fear sharper than anything the fire itself had produced. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the courtyard remained a chaos of shouting guards and frightened horses, and the roar of flames finally beginning to answer to the bucket lines forming from the well, and in the middle of all that noise, a silence stretched between them that felt loud enough to drown out everything else. Ren pulled back first, yanking the torn collar closed with trembling hands, stepping away from Kane's grip, putting distance between them with the desperate urgency of someone who had just watched a year of careful survival crumble in a single unguarded second. "Ren," Kane said quietly, voice low enough that no one else could hear over the commotion. "Do not," Ren whispered, backing further away. "Please, do not say anything."
I was not going to.
"You saw. I saw enough to understand you have been carrying something heavier than I imagined," Kane said, his voice steady, careful. None of the shock or judgment Ren had braced to hear. "That is all I saw. Nothing more." Ren stared at him, searching his face desperately for some hint of the danger that should have followed such a discovery, the disgust, the anger at being deceived, the immediate call for guards to seize an imposter who had lived inside his stables under false pretenses for nearly a year. None of it came. Kane simply stood there in the firelight, soot smudged across his face, watching Ren with an expression that held no judgment at all, only a kind of careful, aching concern. "You will tell the council," Ren said, though it came out more question than accusation. "I will not." "Why?" "Because whatever reason drove you to hide like this, I do not believe it was born of malice," Kane said, "and because I meant what I told you before. I will wait until you are ready to explain, however long that takes." The fire behind them finally began to die down under the guards' efforts, the roar softening into a hiss and crackle as water doused the last of the flames, and the courtyard slowly filled with exhausted, soot-covered people, beginning the long process of accounting for horses and damage. In the middle of that slow, unwinding chaos, Ren stood frozen, staring at a king who had just discovered a secret capable of ending a life, and who had chosen, in that same breath, to protect it instead. "I do not understand you," Ren said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Then, we are even," Kane replied, "because I have not understood you since the day you arrived, and I find I do not mind the mystery nearly as much as I probably should." Garrick arrived moments later, directing the guards toward the last of the smoldering wreckage, and the moment between them dissolved into the practical business of counting horses and assessing the damage to the stable structure. Ren moved automatically through the motions, checking each recovered animal for burns or injury, grateful for the distraction that gave shaking hands something useful to do. It was well past midnight before the last ember had been extinguished, and the exhausted stable hands were finally released to what remained of their sleep. Ren climbed back up to the loft, moving slower than usual, every muscle aching from smoke and exertion and the lingering terror of discovery. The wooden box beneath the mattress felt heavier than usual that night, and Ren sat with it in lap for a long while, turning the stitched cloth over between soot-stained fingers, thinking of the family crest embroidered there, thinking of the name that had once belonged to someone very different from the quiet, guarded stable hand the castle knew. A soft knock came at the base of the ladder some time later, and Ren tensed immediately, expecting Colin or one of the guards checking on the aftermath of the fire. Instead, Kane's voice called up quietly, careful not to wake the rest of the exhausted household. "May I come up?" Ren hesitated only a moment before answering, "Yes." Kane climbed the ladder slowly, still smudged with soot from the fire, and settled onto the floor of the small loft, rather than presuming to sit on the narrow bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the distant settling creak of the damaged stable below, and the soft rustle of straw beneath them. "I am not here to ask questions," Kane said finally. "I only wanted to see that you were truly unharmed. The fire took more than it should have, and I could not sleep without being certain." Ren studied him in the dim moonlight filtering through the small loft window, searching again for some hidden motive, some angle of advantage a king might seek from such a moment, and finding, once more, only quiet sincerity. "I am unharmed," Ren said softly, "thanks to you pulling me back." "Thanks to both of us pulling each other back," Cain corrected. "I very nearly ran straight into a collapsing beam. You are not the only reckless one tonight." A small, tired laugh escaped before Ren could stop it, surprising them both. Cain smiled at the sound, something warm and unguarded crossing his soot-streaked face, and for a brief, fragile moment, the weight of secrets and danger, and the whole burning night, seemed to lift just slightly from Ren's shoulders. "You should sleep," Cain said eventually, rising to leave. "Tomorrow will bring enough questions from the council about the fire, without you exhausted on top of it. And you," Ren said, "your council will have questions of their own, about where their king disappeared to at this hour." "Let them ask," Cain said, echoing words Ren had once used against him, and something about hearing them returned felt strangely comforting. He paused at the top of the ladder, before descending, looking back one final time. "Whatever you are hiding, Ren, I meant what I said. I will wait, however long it takes." He disappeared down into the darkness below, leaving Ren alone once more, with the wooden box, the torn shirt, and the terrifying fragile relief of a secret, discovered and, somehow, against every expectation, protected rather than exposed. Morning arrived too quickly, sunlight pouring through the loft window and illuminating the extent of the previous night's damage. Ren descended the ladder to find the eastern half of the stable reduced to blackened timber and ash, the horses that had once sheltered there now crowded into makeshift stalls along the western wall, still skittish from the smell of smoke that clung stubbornly to everything. Garrick arrived shortly after sunrise, walking the perimeter of the wreckage with a grim expression, questioning each stable hand in turn about how the fire had started and who had been present when it broke out. When he reached Ren, his eyes lingered a moment too long, sharp and assessing in a way that made the careful disguise feel suddenly very thin. "You were the first to reach the horses," Garrick said. "I sleep closest to the stalls," Ren answered, keeping the voice low and even. "I heard the screaming before anyone else. The king pulled you from the building himself, that is what the guards tell me. He arrived to help, as did many others." Garrick studied Ren for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, and Ren wondered, with a fresh spike of fear, whether word of the king's frequent visits to the stable had already reached him in some form, whether this fire had simply given him a convenient excuse to look more closely at something he had already begun to suspect. "See that the damage is repaired quickly," Garrick said finally, turning away. "We cannot afford weakened defenses with the northern border already tense. And stable hand." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Be careful where you place your loyalty. Kings have a way of forgetting those beneath them once the danger has passed." He walked away before Ren could respond, leaving the words hanging heavy in the smoke-scented morning air. Ren stood very still for a long while afterward, turning the warning over, uncertain whether it had been meant as simple advice or something closer to a threat. Inside the castle, the War Council convened earlier than usual to address both the fire and the mounting border tensions, and Iris arrived already irritated, having heard secondhand that Cain had personally entered the burning stable the night before, an act she considered reckless and unbecoming of a king soon to be married. "You could have died," she said sharply, once the two of them found a private moment before the council began. "For horses, Cain. You risked your life for horses." "Not only horses," Cain said, before he could stop himself. Iris's eyes narrowed immediately. Then what? Cain hesitated, aware of how close he had come to revealing something he was not yet prepared to explain, even to himself. "People," he said instead, careful and vague. "The stable hands were still inside when I arrived." Iris did not look entirely convinced, but the council chamber doors opened before she could press further, and the moment passed into the business of the day. Maps and reports, and the growing certainty that war along the northern border could not be delayed much longer. Cain sat through the entire session with his mind divided, one half tracking the discussion of troop movements, the other lingering on a torn collar and a truth glimpsed in firelight that he was determined to protect, whatever the cost of keeping it hidden might eventually become. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace, only fractured images of fire and falling beams, and gray eyes watching from firelight, patient and unafraid, waiting for a truth that Wren was not yet ready to give. A guard Wren had never seen before stood at the edge of the stable yard at dawn, watching the morning routine with the kind of patient attention that immediately set every nerve on edge. Wren noticed him first while carrying feed buckets across the yard, a broad-shouldered man in the plain gray of the household guard, rather than the polished armor of the border patrol, standing motionless near the water trough with his eyes tracking every stable hand who crossed his line of sight. He said nothing, asked nothing, simply watched, and something about his stillness felt far more dangerous than any direct question could have been. By midday, a second guard had joined him, and the two exchanged quiet words while glancing toward the loft where Wren slept, and toward the stall where Cain most often lingered during his visits. Wren's stomach tightened with each glance, each murmured word, certain that whatever conversation passed between them concerned the king's unexplained absences and the stable hand he seemed to visit more often than duty required. Edmund arrived that afternoon, dismounting from his horse with the deliberate calm of someone who had rehearsed his approach carefully beforehand. He found Wren mucking out a stall near the repaired section of the stable and leaned against the wooden post, arms crossed, watching for a long moment before speaking. "You have become quite important to my brother," he said finally, voice carrying no obvious hostility, only careful observation. Wren kept working, refusing to let the words show any effect. "I feed his horses and keep his stables in order. That is all." "Is it?" Edmund tilted his head slightly. "Because he has missed 4 council meetings this month, and each time, he is found here, with you. That is not the behavior of a king simply checking on his horses. Perhaps you should ask him." "I have. He gives me nothing useful." Edmund pushed off from the post and stepped closer, his tone shifting from casual observation into something sharper. "Let me be clear. I do not believe you are dangerous in the way Garrick fears. I do not think you are a spy sent by some rival pack to whisper secrets into my brother's ear. But something about you has changed him, and I need to understand what that something is, because a distracted king is a vulnerable king, and we cannot afford vulnerability with the border as tense as it currently stands." Wren straightened slowly, meeting Edmund's gaze directly for the first time, aware of how much rode on the next few words. "I have no interest in distracting your brother from his duties. And yet you do, whether you intend to or not." The words landed heavier than Wren expected, settling into the same place where Garrick's warning had lodged only days before. 2 members of the king's inner circle now suspected something significant, circling closer to a truth that would end everything the moment it was fully exposed. "What do you intend to do?" Wren asked quietly. "For now, nothing," Edmund said. "I have not told Garrick what I suspect, because I do not yet know what I am dealing with, and I refuse to act on incomplete information. But understand this, I love my brother, and I will protect his throne even from himself if necessary. If you become a threat to that throne, stable hand, I will not hesitate." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Wren standing amid the familiar smell of hay and horse, suddenly feeling far less safe within these walls than the routine of the past year had allowed. That evening, Cain arrived later than usual, slipping through the side entrance well after most of the household had settled for the night. He found Wren sitting on the overturned crate near Pharaoh's stall, staring at nothing in particular, expression drawn and distant. "You look troubled," Cain said, settling nearby. "Your brother came to see me today." Cain's expression sharpened immediately. "What did he say?" "That you have missed 4 council meetings this month. That he suspects I have somehow distracted you from your duties. That he will not hesitate to act if he decides I am a threat to your throne." Cain's jaw tightened, and for a moment, anger flickered across his face, quickly suppressed beneath careful control. "He should not have approached you directly. He is trying to protect you," Wren said. "I cannot fault him for that, even if it terrifies me. I will speak with him." "And say what? That you cannot explain why you keep returning here, because even you do not fully understand it yourself?" Wren shook their heads slowly. "That will only deepen his suspicion, not ease it." Cain fell silent, recognizing the truth in the observation, and the two of them sat together in the quiet stable, the weight of watching guards and suspicious council members pressing down around them like an invisible cage tightening slowly with each passing day. "Perhaps I should stop coming," Cain said eventually. though the words seemed to cost him something significant to speak aloud. Ren's chest tightened at the suggestion, a reaction sharper and more painful than expected, revealing feelings that had been growing quietly for weeks without ever being fully acknowledged. "Is that what you want?" "No," Kane admitted, "but it may be what is necessary. For your safety, if nothing else." "My safety was never guaranteed the moment I arrived at these walls," Ren said quietly. "I have lived with danger long enough to recognize its shape. What frightens me now is not discovery. It is the thought of losing the one place in this kingdom where I have felt, even briefly, like a person rather than a hidden thing waiting to be found." Kane reached out, hesitant, and took Ren's hand in his, the gesture careful and questioning, offering an easy retreat if it was not welcome. Ren did not pull away. Instead, fingers curled slowly around his in return, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence carrying more honesty than any words could have managed. "Then we will be more careful," Kane said finally. "I will find reasons to visit that satisfy the council. I will attend enough meetings that Garrick has no cause for complaint, but I will not stop coming here, Ren, not unless you ask me to." "I will not ask that," Ren whispered. The guards outside continued their quiet watch through the following days, and Edmund's careful observation did not relent, but Kane, true to his word, began appearing at council meetings with renewed attention, offering sharp insight on border strategy and troop movement that quieted much of Garrick's earlier suspicion. He still found his way to the stable most evenings, though the visits grew shorter, more careful, time to avoid the guards' rotating watch schedule that Ren had memorized within days of noticing their presence. It was during one such careful evening visit, nearly a week after Edmund's warning, that Iris arrived unannounced at the stable entrance, drawn by whispers among the household staff that had finally reached her ears, despite Kane's efforts at discretion. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching Kane and Ren seated close together near the repaired stall, hands no longer touching, but positioned in a way that suggested they recently had been. "So this is where you disappear to," she said, voice tight with barely controlled anger. Kane rose immediately, putting careful distance between himself and Ren, though the damage of the moment had already been done. "Iris, do not," she said sharply. "Do not explain yourself as though I am foolish enough to accept whatever excuse you have prepared. I have suspected for weeks that something kept pulling you away from your duties, and now I find you here, with a stable hand, sharing a silence that speaks louder than any conversation." "It is not what you imagine," Kane said, though even he seemed to recognize how weak the words sounded. "Then tell me what it is," Iris demanded, "because from where I stand, it looks very much like my betrothed has found comfort in the company of someone far beneath his station, while I am left to explain his absences to a war council, growing more suspicious by the day." Ren remained silent throughout the exchange, aware that any words offered now would only deepen the wound rather than ease it, and watched instead as Kane struggled to find an answer that would satisfy Iris without revealing the truth that was not his secret alone to give away. "I cannot fully explain it," Kane admitted finally. "Not yet, but I promise you, Iris, whatever you believe is happening here, it does not threaten the alliance our marriage is meant to secure." Iris studied him for a long, cold moment, gaze flicking once more toward Ren before settling back on Kane, with an expression that had shifted from anger into something colder and far more calculating. "We will see about that," she said quietly, before turning and walking back into the darkness of the courtyard, leaving behind a silence, heavy with the certainty that whatever fragile peace had existed until now had just been shattered beyond easy repair. 2 mornings later, while Ren was occupied at the far end of the stable helping Colin with a lame gelding, one of Garrick's guards slipped quietly into the loft above, moving with the practiced care of a man accustomed to searching places he was not invited to enter. He worked methodically, lifting the edge of the thin mattress, running careful hands along the wooden floorboards, searching for anything that might explain the strange hold this stable hand seemed to have over the king. His fingers found the wooden box tucked beneath the straw, and he lifted it carefully, turning it over, noting the fine craftsmanship that seemed out of place for someone living in a stable loft. He did not open it. Garrick had given strict instructions to observe only, to gather information rather than disturb it, so that whatever was eventually found could not be dismissed as tampered evidence. The guard memorized the box's location, its weight, the faint symbol carved into its lid that he did not recognize but intended to describe in careful detail to his commander, and returned it exactly as he had found it before climbing back down the ladder and disappearing before Ren returned. Ren noticed nothing amiss that day, too consumed with the gelding's injury and the ordinary business of the stable to think of hidden dangers lurking closer than expected. It was only that night, reaching beneath the mattress out of habit before sleep, that a faint unease settled over the familiar motion, a box sitting perhaps a finger's width from where memory insisted it always rested. Ren sat frozen for a long moment, studying the small discrepancy, uncertain whether exhaustion had simply blurred the memory of its exact placement, or whether someone had, in fact, been here. The uncertainty gnawed through the following days, sharpening every instinct toward caution. Ren began carrying the small stitched cloth and ring, hidden within a pouch worn against the skin, rather than trusting them to the box any longer, keeping only the folded letter behind, its contents already memorized so thoroughly that its physical presence mattered less than the words themselves. Every unfamiliar face near the stable now drew a longer, more careful glance. Every quiet guard standing watch near the water trough became a source of renewed dread. Kane noticed the change immediately during his next visit, the tension in Ren's shoulders, the way gray eyes tracked the stable entrance with new wariness, even during the quietest moments of the evening. "Something has frightened you," he said, settling beside the stall where Ren worked. "It is nothing," Ren said, though the words carried none of their usual conviction. "You have never been a convincing liar to me," Kane said gently. "Please, tell me what has changed." Ren hesitated, weighing the risk of confession against the growing burden of carrying every fear alone, and finally spoke, low and careful. "I believe someone searched my belongings. Nothing was taken, but something was moved, just slightly, and I cannot be certain whether it was carelessness or deliberate." Kane's expression darkened immediately, understanding the implication without needing further explanation. "Garrick," he said, more statement than question. "I do not know for certain." "I do," Kane said grimly. "He has grown far too curious these past weeks, and I fear my brother's warning to you did little to slow his suspicion, only redirected into quieter methods." He reached out, taking Ren's hand once more, the gesture now carrying an urgency it had lacked before. "You must be careful, Ren. More careful than you have ever been. If Garrick is searching your belongings, he is closer to some answer than either of us realized, and I do not know what he intends to do with whatever he finds. And if he finds enough to understand what I am hiding?" Kane's grip tightened, jaw set with a determination that left no room for doubt. "Then he will have to go through me first." The promise settled between them, heavy and unshakable, and for the first time since the searching hands had disturbed her careful hiding place, Ren felt something steady beneath the fear, a certainty that whatever came next, at least one person within these walls intended to stand between danger and the truth still waiting, patiently, to be revealed. Fire had taken everything once before, long before the stable blaze that nearly exposed her secret, and the memory of that first fire still woke Ren gasping in the dark more nights than not. It began the way memory always insisted on beginning, with the sound of hooves thundering across the courtyard of a home that no longer existed, and the screaming that followed close behind. Ren had been called Illyra then, daughter of Calder, heir to a smaller pack whose lands bordered the ambitious territory ruled by a man named Silas Drake, a man who had wanted those lands for years, and finally decided that patience had run its course. The attack came at night, without warning, without the courtesy of a declared war, or a chance to gather allies. Drake's forces swept through the Calder stronghold with brutal efficiency, and Illyra remembered running through smoke-filled corridors with her mother's hand gripping hers so tightly it left bruises, remembered her father's voice shouting orders to guards who were already falling, remembered the moment her mother pushed her through a hidden servant's passage and told her to run and never look back, no matter what she heard. Illyra had looked back, just once, long enough to see the fire consuming the eastern tower, long enough to hear her mother's voice cut off mid-scream, long enough to understand that everything she had known was ending in that single terrible night. She ran for 3 days, before exhaustion and grief finally caught up with her, collapsing at the edge of a forest stream, where an old woman gathering herbs found her half-conscious and near starving. The woman asked no questions, offered food and a place to sleep, And it was there, in that small cottage, far from any pack's territory, that Alira first understood the true scope of what had happened. Word traveled slowly through the countryside, carried by traders and wandering healers, and eventually, it reached even that quiet cottage. The news that the Calder pack had been utterly destroyed, its bloodline declared extinct, its lands absorbed into Drake's growing territory, without resistance from any neighboring pack willing to challenge his claim. Extinct. The word had settled into Alira's chest like a stone, because it meant safety in its own terrible way. If the world believed no Calder heir remained alive, then no one would come searching for one. But it also meant that grief had nowhere to go, no acknowledgement, no justice, only the quiet, permanent erasure of an entire family's existence. She stayed with the old woman for nearly 2 years, learning to survive on wild herbs and quiet caution, until sickness finally took the woman one winter, leaving Alira alone once more, this time with nowhere to return to, and no family left to seek shelter with. It was during that second desperate flight, searching for somewhere safe to disappear into, that the idea first took root, born from necessity, rather than any grand plan. A young man traveling alone drew far less suspicion than a young woman. A stable hand asking for work in exchange for food and shelter raised far fewer questions than a noblewoman, with no family, and no explanation for her circumstances. She cut her hair with a borrowed knife on the edge of a riverbank, bound her chest with strips of cloth torn from a spare shirt, roughened her voice through weeks of careful practice, and buried the name Alira Calder somewhere in the ashes of the home that had once carried it proudly. Ren emerged from that riverbank, quiet and watchful, carrying nothing but a small wooden box salvaged from the wreckage of her old life, and a determination to survive long enough to matter again someday, even if that day never actually arrived. The Ashworth stables had been the 5th place Ren sought shelter, and the first that never asked uncomfortable questions about a young stable hand's past. The stable master at the time, an older man who retired shortly after Ren's arrival, had simply looked at the exhausted, hollow-eyed traveler standing at his door and offered work without demanding explanation, perhaps recognizing something in that haunted expression that reminded him of losses of his own. It should have remained simple: feed the horses, muck the stalls, keep quiet, keep hidden, wait for the danger to fade with time, the way old wounds eventually scarred over. It had been simple, for nearly a year, until the day a king with tired eyes and a burden too heavy for his own shoulders wandered into the stable seeking quiet, and found instead a stranger who understood exactly what it meant to carry a weight too large to speak aloud. Ren had not intended to grow close to him. Every instinct honed through years of careful survival screamed against the danger of attachment, against the vulnerability of being truly seen by anyone, let alone a king whose attention could unravel everything with a single careless word. And yet somehow, across months of quiet conversations and shared silences in the dim stable light, something had shifted despite every precaution. Something Ren had not allowed herself since the night her mother's hand had released hers and pushed her toward survival alone. Sitting in the loft now, turning the memories over in the dark, Ren understood with painful clarity how close the fragile disguise had come to shattering entirely. The torn collar during the fire, the guard's search of her hidden belongings, Edmund's careful suspicion, and Garrick's cold warning, all of it circling closer to a truth that, once revealed, could not simply be tucked away and forgotten. If Drake ever learned that a Calder heir still lived, hidden within the very walls of a pack whose alliance he had long sought to weaken through the marriage between Cain and Iris, the consequences would extend far beyond Ren's own safety. It would mean war on a scale the current border tensions could not compare to, a war fought not over disputed territory, but over the terrifying possibility that a supposedly extinct bloodline might rise again to reclaim what had been stolen. Ren had told herself for months that staying hidden was the safest choice, not only for her own survival, but for the fragile peace the entire region depended upon. But watching Cain's steady determination to protect her, feeling the warmth of his hand closing around hers in the quiet stable, some small, dangerous part of Ren had begun to wonder whether hiding forever was truly the only option left, or whether the truth, however catastrophic its revelation might prove, was owed to more than just herself. A soft sound at the base of the ladder drew Ren's attention, and for a moment, fear flared bright and immediate, until Cain's familiar voice called up quietly into the darkness. I could not sleep, he said, climbing up slowly. I kept thinking of Garrick's search, and I wanted to be certain you were resting easier than I am. Ren studied him in the dim light, weighing, for the first time, the possibility of finally sharing at least a portion of the truth that had remained locked away for nearly 2 years. The fear of discovery had not lessened, but something about watching Kane's steady loyalty across these past difficult weeks had begun to shift the balance of what felt possible. Kane, Ren said quietly, using his name without title for the first time. If I told you something that could change everything you believe about who I am, and about what danger my presence might bring to your kingdom, would you still choose to protect me? Kane settled slowly onto the floor of the loft, his expression serious, attentive, free of the impatience or demand that might have accompanied such a question from a lesser man. I have already chosen, he said simply. Whatever you tell me now only adds detail to a decision I made weeks ago. Ren's hands trembled slightly as they reached for the pouch hidden against her skin, fingers closing around the small stitched cloth, bearing a crest she had not shown to another living soul in nearly 2 years. The choice to reveal it now felt enormous, terrifying, and inevitable all at once. A door finally opening after years of being held desperately shut. Then I need to tell you who I truly am, Ren whispered. And I need you to understand that once I do, there will be no going back to the quiet life either of us has grown used to. Kane reached out, steady and unafraid, and took her trembling hand in both of his. I am listening, he said. Whatever comes next, I am listening. Ren drew a slow breath, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, spoke the name she had buried on the edge of a riverbank. My name is Elira Calder. She watched his face carefully as the name settled between them, watched recognition flicker, and then deepen into something close to disbelief. Calder, Kane repeated quietly. The pack Drake destroyed. Everyone believes the bloodline ended that night, Ren said, voice steadying now that the truth had finally begun to spill free. My mother pushed me through a hidden passage and told me to run. I was the only one who escaped the fire. I have spent nearly 2 years since then hiding exactly who I am, because if Drake ever learned even one Calder heir survived, he would not rest until that fact was erased, along with everything else he took from my family. She told him the rest slowly, the years of wandering, the old woman by the stream, the sickness that left her alone again, the desperate decision at the riverbank to become someone the world would overlook entirely. Kane listened without interrupting, his grip on her hand never loosening, his expression shifting from shock into something that looked almost like grief on her behalf. Grief for a childhood stolen, and a family erased, and 2 years spent surviving as someone else entirely, simply to stay alive. The scar on your arm, he said finally, understanding dawning slow and heavy. That was not an accident. A guard caught me as I fled through the passage. I do not remember much beyond the pain and the fire behind me. I only remember running, until my legs gave out, days later, beside a stream that saved my life twice over. And the crest, Kane said, nodding toward the pouch still clutched in her hand. That belonged to your family. Ren opened the pouch with careful, trembling fingers and drew out the small stitched cloth, holding it out for him to see in the dim light. The Calder crest, a hawk in flight above a river, worked in fading blue thread by hands that no longer existed to make another. Kane studied it for a long moment, something solemn passing across his face as he recognized the weight of what she had just placed into his keeping. I have heard stories of the Calder fall, he said quietly. My father spoke of it once, with regret he rarely showed for matters outside our own borders. He believed Drake overstepped in ways that would eventually cost him, though no pack was willing to challenge his claim to your family's lands at the time. No one came, Ren said, and the old bitterness crept back into her voice, despite 2 years of trying to bury it. No allies rode to help. No neighboring pack objected when Drake absorbed our territory. The world simply let us disappear, and called it politics, rather than what it truly was. Kane's jaw tightened, anger flickering behind his eyes, though Ren understood it was not directed at her. That will not happen again, he said. Not while I have breath to prevent it. You do not yet understand what you are promising, Ren said softly. If Drake ever learns I survived, and that I have been sheltered within your walls all this time, he will see it as provocation enough to move against your kingdom directly. The alliance your marriage to Iris is meant to secure exists specifically to guard against his ambitions. Protecting me could unravel everything that Alliance was built to prevent. Then we will face that danger when it arrives, Kane said, his voice steady, despite the enormity of what she had just described. I will not send you back into hiding, Alira. Not after everything you have already survived alone. The old name, spoken aloud in his voice for the first time, struck something deep and long dormant in Ren's chest, a fragile, unfamiliar warmth that came from being seen fully, finally, by someone who had chosen to stay, regardless of the cost. She did not correct him, did not insist on the safer, smaller name that had kept her alive this long. For the first time since the riverbank, she allowed herself to simply exist as both names at once, Ren and Alira together, neither one erasing the other. Thank you, she whispered, for listening, for not turning away. I could never turn away from you, Kane said simply, and in the quiet dark of the loft, surrounded by the settling sounds of horses below, and the fragile new truth now shared between them, neither of them spoke of the danger waiting just beyond the walls, content, for this one stolen moment, to simply exist together in the fullness of a truth finally spoken aloud. A folded note appeared beneath Ren's pillow 3 days after the confession in the loft, and the moment fingers brushed against the unfamiliar paper, every muscle in Ren's body went cold with dread. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, clearly written by someone accustomed to formal correspondence, rather than the rough scrawl of a stable hand or guard. Ren unfolded it slowly, reading the few short lines twice before the meaning fully settled. I know you are not what you claim to be. Meet me at the eastern garden wall tonight, an hour past sunset, alone. Tell no one, especially not the king. If you fail to appear, I will bring my suspicions directly to the War Council instead, and let them draw their own conclusions about what a stable hand might be hiding. There was no signature, but Ren did not need one. The elegant handwriting matched notes Ren had glimpsed before, tacked to the stable message board announcing schedule changes for the horses used in Lady Iris Vane's morning rides. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy, mucking stalls and checking hooves while every thought circled back to the note hidden beneath the loose floorboard, where the wooden box had once rested before caution moved its contents elsewhere. Ren considered telling Kane immediately, breaking the demand for secrecy before it had even been honored, but something in the note's careful wording suggested that defiance might only accelerate whatever plan Iris had already set into motion. Better to understand the danger first. Better to meet it directly and gauge exactly how much Iris knew before deciding how to respond. The eastern garden lay quiet and shadowed when Ren arrived that evening, moonlight filtering through the hedges in uneven patches across the gravel path. Iris was already waiting near the old stone wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the dim light. You came, Iris said. I wondered if you would be foolish enough to ignore my warning. What do you want? Ren asked, keeping voice low and steady, despite the fear coiling tight beneath the surface. The truth, Iris said simply. I have watched you for weeks now. The way you carry yourself, the way you speak, when you forget to guard your words carefully enough, the way Kane looks at you, which is not the way a king looks at a stable hand, however skilled that stable hand might be with horses. She stepped closer, studying Ren's face in the moonlight with an intensity that made hiding feel suddenly impossible. You are no ordinary stable hand. I do not yet know what you truly are, but I intend to find out, one way or another. And if I refuse to tell you? Then I bring my suspicions to Garrick, Iris said, and let his investigators do the work I am currently offering you the chance to avoid. I imagine whatever you are hiding would survive that scrutiny far worse than it would survive an honest conversation with me. Ren studied her carefully, searching for the angle of advantage Iris clearly believed she held, and found, beneath the cold calculation, something else entirely, something closer to genuine hurt disguised as strategy. Whatever Iris's suspicions, they were tangled inseparably with the wound of watching her betrothed's attention drift towards someone else entirely, and that wound, Ren understood, made her dangerous in ways calculation alone could not fully explain. Whatever I tell you, Ren said slowly, I need your word that it goes no further than this garden, at least until I have had the chance to prepare for whatever consequences follow. I make no promises to a stable hand who has already spent months deceiving this entire household, Iris said sharply. You will tell me the truth, and I will decide afterward what to do with it. It was not the answer Ren had hoped for, but the alternative, refusing entirely, and risking Garrick's guards descending without warning, felt far more dangerous than trusting Iris with at least a portion of the truth. Wren drew a slow breath, weighing every word carefully before speaking. "I am not a spy," Wren said. "I hold no allegiance to any enemy of this kingdom. What I am hiding concerns only my own survival, nothing more." "It tells you the most important part," Wren said. "The rest endangers more than just myself, if it spreads carelessly." Iris's eyes narrowed, frustration and suspicion warring visibly across her face. "You expect me to accept half a truth and walk away satisfied?" "I expect you to understand that some truths, spoken too soon, or to the wrong ears, cause more harm than the silence that came before them," Wren said. "I am not protecting myself alone by staying quiet. I am protecting this kingdom from a danger far larger than anything currently troubling your war council." Something in the words seemed to catch Iris's attention despite herself, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through the calculated anger she had arrived with. "What danger?" "One I cannot name yet. Not until I understand whether you intend to help protect this kingdom, or simply use whatever you learn as a weapon against me." The standoff stretched between them, moonlight casting long shadows across the garden path, until finally Iris exhaled sharply and stepped back, arms uncrossing though her expression remained guarded. "You have bought yourself time," she said. "Not trust. Time. I will not go to Garrick tonight. But understand this clearly. My family sent me here to secure an alliance through marriage, and I will not watch that alliance crumble, because a king has grown distracted by a mystery he refuses to fully explain. If you truly care for this kingdom's safety, as you claim, then find a way to resolve whatever you are hiding, before it destroys the peace my marriage is meant to secure." She turned and walked back toward the castle without waiting for a response, leaving Wren alone in the quiet garden, breathing hard with relief that had not yet fully settled into anything resembling safety. The reprieve felt fragile, temporary, a held breath rather than a resolved danger, and Wren understood that whatever time had just been purchased would not last indefinitely. Kane found Wren still standing near the garden wall nearly an hour later, having grown worried when the usual evening visit to the stable never materialized. His relief at finding Wren unharmed quickly turned to alarm once the details of the confrontation with Iris spilled out between them. "She threatened to go to Garrick," Kane said, anger tightening his voice. "This cannot continue. Every day we delay, the danger of discovery grows larger, and now Iris holds a piece of that danger in her hands as well." "I bought us time," Wren said. "Not much, but enough perhaps, to decide what comes next." Kane fell silent for a long moment, staring out across the moonlit garden, clearly turning over possibilities that had not existed before this night. "Perhaps it is time to stop hiding entirely," he said finally, though the words seemed to cost him considerable weight to speak. "Perhaps the danger of discovery on our own terms is smaller than the danger of discovery forced upon us by someone else's hand." "That decision is not only yours to make," Wren said quietly. "If the truth comes out, it will not only affect me, it will affect your entire kingdom, your alliance with Iris's family, and whatever fragile peace currently holds along the northern border." "I know," Kane said, "which is why I will not make that decision alone. But I need you to understand, Wren, that I have grown tired of watching you live in fear, within walls that are meant to offer safety, rather than constant vigilance. Whatever comes next, we will decide it together, and we will face it together, whatever the cost proves to be." The promise settled between them, heavier now than it had felt in the quiet loft days before, carrying the full weight of consequences that neither of them could fully predict. Iris did not sleep that night. She sat alone in her chamber, long after the candles had burned low, turning the stable hand's careful, guarded words over in her mind, searching for the shape of whatever secret lay just beyond her reach. A danger to the kingdom, larger than the border tensions currently occupying the War Council. It was not the answer of a spy, nor the answer of someone hiding a simple crime. It was the answer of someone carrying a truth too large to speak aloud without consequence, and the more Iris considered it, the more her calculated anger began to shift into something closer to genuine unease. She had come to this kingdom prepared to accept a marriage built on strategy rather than affection, understanding from childhood that her role was to secure peace through alliance, not to expect devotion from a husband chosen for reasons of politics rather than love. She had told herself she could accept a marriage without warmth, provided it served its purpose. What she could not accept was watching that purpose crumble, because her betrothed had grown consumed by a mystery neither of them fully understood. By morning, her uncertainty had hardened back into resolve, though its shape had shifted from simple jealousy into something more calculating. If the stable hand truly carried a secret capable of threatening the kingdom, then Iris reasoned she owed it to her own family, and to the alliance she had been sent here to secure, to understand exactly what that danger entailed, with or without Wren's cooperation. She began quietly, discreetly, asking careful questions of the household staff who had served the castle long before Wren's arrival, inquiring about the exact circumstances under which a stranger had been given work in the royal stables, with no family name and no history to speak of. The answers she gathered were thin, uncertain, memories of an exhausted traveler appearing one autumn evening with a limp and haunted eyes, asking only for food and shelter in exchange for labor. No papers, no references, no explanation beyond quiet, guarded silence that the previous stable master had chosen not to question. It was not enough to build a case, but it was enough to sharpen Iris's suspicion into something closer to certainty, that whatever Wren was hiding predated the arrival at these walls by a considerable measure, tangled up with whatever crisis had left a traveler alone, and desperate enough to invent an entirely new identity, rather than seek help through any conventional means. She considered, briefly, honoring her word to Wren and allowing more time before acting further. But each day that passed brought fresh whispers among the household staff, quiet observations about the king's continued visits to the stable, about the strange tension that had settled over Edmund and Garrick, both since the fire, about the careful way everyone seemed to be circling a truth no one dared speak aloud directly. The longer the secret remained buried, Iris reasoned, the more damage it seemed to be doing regardless, and perhaps the kindest resolution, both for the kingdom and for her own wounded pride, was to force the truth into the open before it could fester any further in silence. She began, carefully and without any outward sign of her intentions, to plan a moment when the truth might be revealed publicly, cleanly, in a setting where the council could witness it directly, rather than relying on second-hand rumor and speculation. A public gathering was already scheduled within the coming days, a formal dinner marking the anniversary of the alliance treaty between their two families, attended by nobles and commanders from across the kingdom. It would be, Iris decided, the perfect setting to finally force the mystery into daylight, whatever the consequences proved to be for anyone involved. She told no one of her plan, not even Garrick, whose blunt methods she distrusted as likely to provoke violence rather than clarity. She would handle this herself, quietly, and let the truth reveal itself in front of witnesses who could not simply dismiss or bury whatever emerged. Whether that revelation would restore the alliance she had been sent to secure, or shatter it entirely, Iris could not yet say, but the uncertainty no longer frightened her the way it once had. She had made her decision, and the days remaining before the anniversary dinner passed with the quiet, deliberate tension of a trap slowly closing around a truth that had, until now, managed to survive within these walls unseen. Wren felt the shift without understanding its cause, a prickling unease that settled over the stable in the days following the garden meeting. Iris no longer sought her out directly, no longer sent notes demanding secret conversations, and the absence of pressure should have brought relief. Instead, it brought something colder, the particular quiet that settles before a storm breaks, rather than after one passes. "She has stopped asking questions," Wren said to Kane one evening, voice troubled. "That worries me more than when she was asking them constantly." "Perhaps she has simply accepted what you told her," Kane offered, though his tone carried little conviction. "Or perhaps she has decided she no longer needs my answers," Wren said. "Perhaps she intends to find her own." Kane said nothing for a long moment, watching the lantern light flicker against the stable walls, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "The anniversary dinner approaches in a few days. All the great houses will attend. If Iris intends to act, it would be the setting she could not resist, a public stage, witnesses who cannot be silenced afterward." Wren's stomach turned cold at the thought, imagining a hall full of nobles and commanders watching the careful disguise unravel in front of every powerful family in the kingdom. "Then we have very little time left to prepare for whatever comes." "No," Kane agreed quietly. "We do not. The great hall blazed with candlelight and the low murmur of powerful voices when the doors swung open, and every head turned toward the unfamiliar figure standing where a servant should have been. Wren had not planned to attend the anniversary dinner. Stable hands did not belong among nobles and commanders gathered to celebrate a treaty between great houses, and every instinct had insisted on staying far from a room filled with exactly the kind of scrutiny that had threatened the fragile disguise for weeks. But a message had arrived that afternoon, unsigned, instructing Wren to appear in the hall precisely when the second course was served, and to come dressed as presentably as circumstances allowed, or risk a far more public and humiliating summons in front of the entire household. There had been no time to consult Cain, no time to weigh the danger properly before the hour arrived, and left no choice but compliance. Wren stood now at the threshold of the great hall, borrowed clothes ill-fitting but clean, heart hammering so loudly it seemed impossible that the entire room could not hear it. Iris rose from her seat near the head table, her expression composed and cool, betraying nothing of the calculation that had brought this moment into being. "Thank you for joining us," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall. "I believe there is something our guests deserve to understand about the company our king has been keeping." Cain went rigid at the head table, understanding immediately what was unfolding, rising from his seat with alarm plain across his face. "Iris, whatever you intend." "Sit down, Cain," Iris said, not unkindly, though the command in her voice left no room for argument. "You have kept this secret hidden long enough. It is time the rest of us understood what has been distracting our king from his duties these past months." Garrick leaned forward at his place along the table, eyes narrowing with the sharp attention of a man who had suspected something significant for weeks, and now sensed its resolution arriving. Edmund's hand tightened around his goblet, watching his brother with quiet, worried eyes, understanding that whatever came next could not be stopped from this distance. Iris crossed the hall slowly, deliberately, until she stood directly in front of Wren and reached out before anyone could object, tearing loose the collar of the borrowed shirt with a single sharp motion that revealed, in full view of every noble and commander gathered in that hall, the binding beneath and the unmistakable truth it had concealed for nearly a year. Gasps rippled through the hall like a wave breaking against stone. Whispers erupted immediately, confusion and shock and, from certain corners, something closer to outrage. "A woman," Garrick said, rising slowly from his seat, voice hard with disbelief. "A woman has been living disguised among the royal stables for the better part of a year, and our king has been sneaking away to visit her." "This is deception of the highest order," another lord called out from further down the table. "How do we know she is not a spy sent by some rival house, hiding in plain sight to gather secrets?" "Seize her," Garrick commanded sharply, and two guards near the hall entrance moved immediately toward Wren, who stood frozen, the exposed truth leaving nowhere left to hide, nothing left to disguise. "Stop," Cain's voice rang out across the hall, sharp and absolute, the full authority of his position settling over the chaos like a physical weight. The guards halted immediately, and the room fell into an uneasy, expectant silence. "No one touches her." "Cain," Garrick said, disbelief plain in his voice. "She has deceived this entire household for nearly a year. We do not even know her true identity, let alone her intentions." "Her name," Cain said, stepping down from the head table and crossing the hall to stand beside Wren, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, a deliberate, visible show of protection in front of every witness gathered there. "Is Alira Calder." The name landed across the hall like a struck bell, silence deepening into something colder and more astonished than the gasps that had come before. Several of the older lords exchanged sharp, startled glances, recognition dawning slowly across weathered faces that remembered the Calder name from decades of shifting alliances and border disputes. "That is not possible," one of the older commanders said, rising slowly from his seat. "The Calder bloodline was declared extinct years ago. Silas Drake destroyed that entire house." "He believed he had," Cain said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was revealing in front of the assembled nobility. "He was wrong. Alira survived that night, and has lived hidden within these walls for nearly a year, disguised out of necessity, not deception meant to harm this kingdom." The hall erupted into a chaos of overlapping voices, some demanding explanation, others already calculating the political consequences of a supposedly extinct bloodline suddenly proven false. And beneath all of it, Ren stood frozen beside Cain, exposed in every sense of the word, watching the careful disguise that had protected her for so long crumble completely in front of witnesses who could never be made to forget what they had just seen. Iris watched the unfolding chaos with an expression that had shifted from cold calculation into something closer to shock of her own, clearly having expected exposure of deception, perhaps even scandal, but not the revelation of a bloodline believed extinct for years, carrying implications for the entire region's political balance that extended far beyond anything she had anticipated when she set this trap into motion. "You knew this," Garrick said, turning on Cain with fresh fury, "and you said nothing. You hid the survival of an heir whose very existence could ignite war with Drake's territory, and you told no one, not even your own war council." "I protected someone who had already lost everything once to that same enemy," Cain said, refusing to back down despite the mounting anger surrounding him. "I did not act carelessly. I acted to prevent exactly the danger you now fear, understanding that premature exposure would endanger her life and potentially this kingdom's stability. Far more than careful, protected silence." "And now that silence has ended," Garrick said grimly, gesturing toward the stunned, whispering hall around them, "whether you intended it or not." Edmund rose from his seat at last, moving to stand on Ren's other side, an unexpected show of support that drew fresh murmurs from the watching nobles. "My brother is right about one thing," he said, addressing the hall directly. "Whatever comes of this revelation, it will not be resolved through panic or hasty judgment tonight. Alira Calder has done nothing but survive an atrocity that this very hall failed to prevent when it happened. We owe her, at minimum, the chance to be heard before we decide what her survival means for this kingdom's future." The hall remained tense, divided, some faces still hostile with suspicion, others softening slightly under Edmund's measured words. And in the middle of it all, Ren stood between two brothers who had chosen, without hesitation, to shield her from a mob that might easily have turned violent given a different response. "What do you intend to do with her?" one of the visiting lords finally asked, addressing Cain directly, the question carrying the weight of an entire hall's uncertain expectation. Cain looked down at Ren, at the fear and exhaustion plain across features no longer hidden behind careful disguise, and then back up at the assembled nobility waiting for his answer, understanding that whatever he said next would shape not only Ren's fate, but the entire trajectory of his kingdom's future. "I intend to protect her," he said finally, voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "as I would protect any innocent survivor of Drake's cruelty, and I intend to determine, carefully and deliberately, what her survival means for the political balance of this region, rather than allowing panic or old grudges to decide that question for us tonight." It was not a complete answer, not the decisive resolution the hall seemed to crave, but it was enough, for the moment, to hold back the immediate threat of violence or arrest, and as the tension in the hall slowly began to ease into uneasy murmuring rather than open hostility, Ren understood that whatever safety remained now depended entirely on Cain's willingness to stand firm against a kingdom's worth of suspicion and fear, a burden neither of them had fully anticipated when this long night of secrets had finally, catastrophically, come undone. Cain escorted Ren from the hall himself, one arm steady around her shoulders, guiding her past rows of watching faces toward a private chamber near the royal quarters, where guards he trusted personally took up position outside the door. The walk felt endless, every step accompanied by whispered voices trailing behind them, some sympathetic, most simply stunned into speculation that would surely spread through the kingdom by morning, regardless of anything said within the hall tonight. Once the chamber door closed behind them, Ren sank onto the edge of a chair, hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation draining away and leaving only exhaustion and fear in its wake. "I am sorry," Cain said quietly, kneeling in front of her. "I should have found a way to protect this before Iris forced it into the open." "You could not have prevented what she decided to do," Ren said, voice unsteady. "None of us could have." "The hall will not forget what they saw tonight," Cain said grimly. "Word of a surviving Calder heir will reach every corner of this kingdom by morning, and from there, it is only a matter of time before it reaches Drake himself." "I know," Ren whispered. I have always known this day might come. I simply hoped I would have more time to prepare for it. A sharp knock interrupted them, and Edmund entered without waiting for permission, closing the door firmly behind him. Garrick is calmed enough to think rather than react, he said, but he will demand answers by morning, and so will half the lords who witnessed tonight's revelation. We need a plan before the sun rises, Kane, or others will decide our course for us. What of Iris? Kane asked. Edmund's expression turned careful. She has not spoken since the hall emptied. I believe even she did not anticipate the scale of what her plan would uncover. Whatever her intentions were tonight, I do not think destruction was truly among them. Ren listened to the brothers discuss strategy, exhaustion pulling at her thoughts even as fear kept sleep firmly out of reach. And beneath it all, a small, unfamiliar feeling began to settle alongside the terror, something like relief. The secret that had governed every choice for nearly 2 years was finally out of her hands entirely, no longer hers alone to carry, no longer a weight she had to bear in complete isolation. Whatever came next, for better or for devastating worse, she would not face it disguised and alone in a stable loft. She would face it as herself, standing beside people who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside her in return. Whatever happens, Kane said, taking her hand again, as Edmund stepped out to organize the guard rotation for the night. You are not facing this alone. Not anymore. Ren nodded, unable to fully trust her voice, and outside the chamber window, the first gray light of dawn had already begun creeping over the horizon, carrying with it the certainty that nothing within these walls, or beyond them, would ever return fully to the careful, hidden quiet of the year now ended. By mid-morning, the council chamber had filled far earlier than usual, every lord and commander who had attended the anniversary dinner now demanding a formal audience with the king. Garrick stood at the head of the gathered nobles, arms crossed, his earlier fury tempered into something more measured, but no less serious. The kingdom needs to understand what you intend to do, Garrick said, once Kane had taken his seat. A woman believed dead for years has surfaced within our own walls, and half the hall watched it happen. Silence is no longer an option, and neither is pretending this changes nothing. I am aware, Kane said evenly. Which is why I intend to address this directly, rather than allow rumor to shape the narrative before we have controlled it ourselves. And what narrative do you propose? Asked one of the visiting lords, skepticism plain in his voice. Kane rose slowly, meeting the eyes of every noble seated around the table. The truth, that an heir of a destroyed house survived, hidden out of necessity, and that this kingdom will not abandon her, to whatever danger her survival now invites. Beyond that, we will need time, and careful counsel, to determine what her survival means for the balance of power along our northern border. The room fell into uneasy murmuring, some nodding slowly in reluctant agreement, others clearly unconvinced, and at the edge of the table, Iris sat silent, her earlier certainty replaced by something far less steady, watching the consequences of her own carefully laid trap unfold into a crisis far larger than she had ever intended to create. A rider arrived from Iris's family estate 3 days after the anniversary dinner, carrying a sealed letter whose message spread through the castle faster than any guard could contain it, and by the time Kane read the words himself, half the household already understood what it demanded. The letter was brief, formal, and unmistakably threatening beneath its careful diplomatic language. Iris's father, Lord Vane, had received word of the previous day's revelation, and he made his position clear without room for negotiation. Either the surviving Calder heir was removed from the royal household entirely, her presence severed completely from any association with the crown, or he would consider the proposed marriage alliance between their houses void, along with the military support it had been designed to secure against the growing threat along the northern border. Kane read the letter twice in the privacy of his chamber, before summoning Edmund and Garrick to discuss its implications, though he already understood, with a grim certainty settling deep in his chest, exactly what choice this letter was forcing him toward. You cannot ignore this, Garrick said, once he had finished reading the letter himself, his expression tight with the particular frustration of a man watching a carefully built strategy unravel. Lord Vane's forces are the difference between holding our northern border and losing it entirely, if Drake decides to press his advantage now, that he may soon learn of the Calder heir's survival. We need that alliance, Kane. We cannot afford to lose it over one woman, however sympathetic her circumstances might be. She is not simply one woman, Kane said. his voice carrying a hard edge that made even Garrick pause. She is the last survivor of a house, destroyed by the very enemy we are trying to defend against. If we abandon her now, to satisfy Lord Vane's demands, we prove that this kingdom offers no true protection to anyone who cannot bring military strength or political leverage to the table. That is a noble sentiment, Garrick said. But nobility does not stop Drake's forces at the border if Vane withdraws his support and leaves us exposed. Edmund, who had remained quiet through the exchange, finally spoke, his tone measured but firm. There may be another path, one that does not require choosing between Alira's safety and the border's protection. Both men turned to him, and Edmund continued, laying out the argument that had been forming in his mind since the previous night. Alira is not merely a survivor to be protected out of charity. She is the rightful heir to the Calder lands, lands that Drake absorbed through conquest rather than any legitimate claim. If her survival becomes public knowledge, as it inevitably will now regardless of what we decide, it changes the entire political calculation along the border. Other houses who resented Drake's expansion but lacked cause to challenge it directly may find, in Alira's survival, exactly the justification they have been waiting for. Kane's expression sharpened with interest. You are suggesting we do not merely protect her. You are suggesting we support her claim to reclaim what was taken from her family. I am suggesting, Edmund said, that a kingdom which helps restore a rightful heir to her stolen lands gains far more than one that simply shelters a refugee out of sympathy. It gains an ally with legitimate claim to territory bordering Drake's own, a claim that other suspicious houses might rally behind far more readily than they would rally behind our border alone. Garrick considered this for a long moment, his earlier hostilities softening slightly under the weight of strategic possibility. It is a considerable risk, he said finally. Drake will not surrender those lands without a fight, and supporting her claim openly all but guarantees conflict rather than avoiding it. Conflict is already guaranteed, Kane said quietly. The only question remaining is whether we face it with Alira, as an ally with legitimate claim to territory that could weaken Drake's position, or whether we abandon her and face Drake's ambitions alone, having proven to every watching house that this kingdom offers no loyalty to those who need it most. The room fell silent, the weight of the decision settling heavily over all three men, until finally Kane rose from his seat, his mind clearly made. I will not abandon her, he said, his voice carrying the absolute finality of a king who had already weighed every consequence and made peace with whatever followed. Send word to Lord Vane that the alliance, as originally proposed, is no longer something I intend to honor under his current demands. If he wishes to withdraw his support entirely, that is his choice to make, but I will not purchase this kingdom's safety by sacrificing an innocent survivor to satisfy his terms. Garrick's jaw tightened, clearly still uneasy with the risk being undertaken, but something in Kane's resolve seemed to settle his objections into reluctant acceptance. Then we had better begin preparing for the consequences immediately, he said. If Vane withdraws his forces, we will need every ally Edmund's strategy can help us secure, and we will need them quickly. News of Kane's decision reached Wren within the hour, delivered by Edmund himself, who found her still confined to the private chamber near the royal quarters. Tension etched into every line of her posture as she waited to learn her fate. He refused Lord Vane's demand, Edmund said without preamble. He has chosen to support your claim to the Calder lands rather than send you away to satisfy an alliance built on convenience rather than loyalty. Wren stared at him, momentarily unable to process the enormity of what she was hearing. He is risking his entire kingdom's security for me. He is risking it for what is right, Edmund corrected gently. And, I suspect, for you specifically as well, though he would likely insist those two things cannot be separated so cleanly. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. I confess, I did not expect to find myself supporting this course of action when I first suspected you of distracting my brother from his duties. But watching you these past days, and understanding now what you survived to reach this point, I believe my brother has chosen correctly, whatever danger it invites. Thank you, Wren said quietly, for believing that, even before you fully understood why. Do not thank me yet, Edmund said, a faint, weary smile touching his face. We have not yet faced the consequences of this choice. Lord Vane's response will likely arrive within days, and Drake's reaction, once word inevitably reaches him, will arrive not long after. Whatever gratitude you owe any of us, save it until we have survived what comes next." That evening, Cain found Wren alone in the private chamber, and the moment their eyes met, months of careful distance and cautious restraint seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by the simple, unguarded relief of two people who had finally stopped hiding from the truth of what stood between them. "You risked everything," Wren said softly, as he crossed the room to stand before her. "I risked an alliance, built on convenience," Cain said. "I did not risk everything. Everything, to me, includes standing beside someone who deserves protection, rather than abandonment, and I would make this same choice again, without hesitation, whatever the cost proves to be. Lord Vane may withdraw his forces entirely. Drake may see this as the opening he has waited years for. Then we will face both of those dangers together," Cain said, taking her hands in his. "As we should have been facing everything, from the moment you first told me your name in that quiet loft. I am done pretending this is simply duty, Alira. I am done pretending I do not care for you beyond what a king should feel for someone sheltered within his walls." Wren felt the careful walls that had protected her for nearly 2 years finally give way completely. Not through discovery or danger this time, but through choice, freely given and freely accepted. "Then let us face whatever comes," she said, "together, exactly as you have promised." Lord Vane's response arrived 4 days later, delivered not by a rider, but by Iris herself, who requested a private audience with Cain before the full council could gather to hear the formal reply. She entered his study with none of the cold composure she had carried into the great hall on the night of the anniversary dinner, her posture instead carrying the weight of a decision that had clearly cost her considerable difficulty to reach. "My father has withdrawn his support," she said without preamble. "The alliance, as it was originally proposed, no longer stands. He considers your refusal to honor his terms a personal insult, and he has already begun recalling the forces he had committed to reinforcing your northern border." Cain absorbed the news with grim acceptance rather than surprise. "I expected as much." "I am not finished," Iris said. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. "I have written to my father separately, informing him that I do not intend to return home with his forces. I intend to remain here, not as your betrothed, since that arrangement no longer serves either of us honestly, but as an advisor to this council, if you will have me." What I set in motion at that dinner revealed a truth larger than either of us anticipated, and I find I cannot simply walk away from the consequences of my own actions, however unintended their scale turned out to be. Cain studied her carefully, surprised by the offer, weighing its sincerity against the considerable damage her original scheme had caused. "You understand this means abandoning the alliance your family sent you here to secure." "I understand," Iris said. "I also understand that the alliance my father demanded was never truly about peace. It was about control, about ensuring this kingdom remained indebted to his forces rather than standing capable on its own merit. I did not fully see that until I watched you choose Alira's safety over his terms, without hesitation. Whatever else I am, I do not wish to be the reason a kingdom sacrifices what is right in favor of what is merely convenient." It was not the apology Cain might have once expected, nor the full reconciliation that could undo the damage already done, but it carried a sincerity that could not be easily dismissed. "I will consider your offer," he said finally, "though I suspect Garrick will need considerable convincing before he trusts your counsel again." "I do not expect trust to return quickly," Iris said. "I only ask for the chance to earn it back, in whatever way remains available to me now." She left the study with far less certainty than she had carried into it, and Cain sat alone for a long while afterward, turning over the shifting alliances, now reshaping themselves around him, understanding that the ground beneath his kingdom had changed permanently, for better or for worse, the moment Wren's true name had been spoken aloud in that crowded hall. Word of Lord Vane's withdrawal spread through the War Council within hours, and Garrick's fresh fury required the better part of an evening to settle into grim, practical planning rather than open recrimination. The northern border, already stretched thin, would now stand with fewer reinforcements than originally planned, and every commander in the room understood clearly that whatever time remained before Drake learned of the Calder heir's survival had just grown considerably shorter and more dangerous. That night, Wren stood at the window of her chamber, watching the same storm clouds Cain had studied from his own quarters, and felt something shift within her that had not stirred in nearly 2 years. Fear remained, steady and familiar, but alongside it now sat something sharper, something closer to purpose. She was no longer simply a survivor hiding from a danger too large to face. She was, whether she felt ready or not, the last claim to a bloodline and a territory that had been stolen through violence rather than any rightful conquest. Colin found her there later that evening, having climbed the stairs with a basket of mended clothes she no longer needed, awkward in his effort to check on her welfare, now that the stable held no place for her among its quiet routines. "Everyone is talking about you," he admitted. "Not unkindly, mostly. Some of the older staff remember your family's name from before. They say your mother was kind to traveling merchants who passed through Calder lands, fair in her dealings, unlike some of the neighboring houses." Wren felt something tighten in her chest at the mention of her mother, memories she had kept carefully locked away, finally beginning to surface now that hiding was no longer required. "I do not remember much of the politics," she admitted. "Only that she loved that land fiercely, and the people on it." "Then perhaps that is where you begin," Colin said, with the simple, unburdened wisdom of someone young enough to still believe things could be as straightforward as they seemed. "Not with armies or alliances, but with remembering what your mother loved, and deciding you intend to protect it the same way she did." Wren watched him go, the words settling deeper than he likely intended, and turned back toward the window, watching the distant storm roll slowly closer across the darkened hills. Whatever came next, whatever danger Drake's inevitable response might bring, she understood now that she was no longer simply running from her past. She was, for the first time since that terrible night of fire and screaming, beginning to walk deliberately toward whatever future remained to be reclaimed. Horns sounded from the northern watchtower before dawn had fully broken, and by the time Kane reached the castle wall still fastening his cloak, the scouts had already confirmed what the entire kingdom had been dreading since the night of the anniversary dinner. Drake's banners moved slowly across the distant hills, a column of riders and foot soldiers stretching far enough along the horizon that the watchmen struggled to estimate their full number with any confidence. This was no small raiding party testing the border's defenses. This was a force assembled deliberately, marching with the unmistakable purpose of a man who had finally received word too significant to ignore. "He knows," Garrick said grimly, standing beside Kane atop the wall, watching the distant column advance with the flat, calculating eyes of a man already running through defensive strategies. "There is no other reason for a force this size to move now, without provocation along the border in recent weeks." "How long until they reach the outer settlements?" Kane asked. 2 days, perhaps 3 if the weather slows them," Garrick said. "Long enough to prepare a defense, though not long enough to gather reinforcements from allies who might otherwise have answered the call before Lord Vane's withdrawal." Wren arrived at the wall moments later, having heard the horns from her chamber, and refused to remain confined, while her own past marched toward the kingdom that had chosen to shelter her. She stood beside Kane, studying the distant banners with an expression that had hardened considerably since the frightened stable hand who once flinched from unexpected shadows. "That is Drake's personal banner," she said quietly, recognizing the sigil even from this distance, memory sharpening details that fear had long tried to bury. "He does not send his personal forces for simple border skirmishes. He has come himself." "Then he intends to settle this personally," Kane said. "Whether through conquest or negotiation, I imagine he has not yet decided." Edmund joined them shortly after, having spent the early hours organizing what defenses remained possible given the reduced forces following Lord Vane's withdrawal. "We are stretched thin," he admitted. "If Drake intends open conflict, we will struggle to hold the outer settlements for more than a few days without reinforcement. Then we need to determine what he actually wants before assuming conflict is inevitable," Wren said, surprising all 3 men with the steadiness of her voice. "Drake did not build his territory through reckless war alone. He is calculating, patient. If he has marched personally, rather than sending an advance force to test our defenses, he may intend negotiation, as much as conquest, at least initially." "Negotiation over what terms?" Garrick asked skeptically. "Over me," Wren said simply. "My survival threatens the legitimacy of his claim over Calder lands more than any army could. If other houses rally behind my claim, as Edmund suggested they might, Drake's hold over that territory becomes considerably less secure. He may prefer to eliminate that threat through negotiation, or through more direct means, before committing to a war that could weaken his position elsewhere." The men fell silent, absorbing the cold clarity of her assessment, and Cain felt a fresh surge of something between pride and dread, watching Ren speak with the calm, practiced authority of someone who had clearly spent years studying the political landscape that had destroyed her family, even while hiding from it entirely. "Whatever he intends," Cain said finally, "we will not simply hand you over to satisfy his terms. That path ends no differently than if we had surrendered you to Lord Vane's demands." "I do not intend to be handed over," Ren said. "I intend to meet him myself, and let him understand clearly that the Calder heir he believed erased will no longer stay hidden, simply because it is convenient for either of us." The suggestion drew immediate objection from all three men, Garrick insisting the risk was reckless beyond reason, Edmund arguing for a more cautious approach that kept Ren safely behind the castle walls while negotiations proceeded through intermediaries, and Cain, torn between the fierce instinct to protect her at any cost and the growing recognition that Ren was no longer the frightened stable hand who needed constant shielding from danger. "I have spent nearly 2 years hiding from this exact confrontation," Ren said, cutting through their objections with quiet, unshakable resolve. "I will not spend whatever time remains hiding from it further. If Drake wishes to negotiate the fate of Calder lands, he will negotiate with the heir who survived his attack, standing in front of him without disguise, without fear, and without apology for the simple fact of remaining alive." Cain studied her for a long moment, recognizing the same determination that had first drawn him to the quiet stable so many months ago, now grown into something far more formidable than either of them could have predicted. "Then you will not face him alone," he said finally. "Whatever terms he brings, he will find not only a surviving heir standing before him, but a king, willing to back her claim, with everything this kingdom can muster." The following 2 days passed in tense preparation. Defenses reinforced as much as the reduced forces allowed. Messengers sent to neighboring houses whose old grievances against Drake's expansion might yet be persuaded into alliance, now that his conquest had proven less permanent than believed. Ren spent the hours reviewing what fragments of political history she could recall from childhood, old alliances and grudges among the border houses that might yet be leveraged in negotiation, while Cain worked alongside Garrick and Edmund to ensure that whatever confrontation came would not catch the kingdom entirely unprepared. On the third morning, Drake's forces halted at the edge of the outer settlements, close enough now that individual banners could be distinguished without the aid of a spyglass, and a lone rider broke away from the column, approaching the castle gates under a flag of parley rather than open aggression. "He wishes to talk first," Garrick observed, watching from the wall with cautious relief. "That, at least, buys us time." The rider delivered his message and departed swiftly, and within the hour, the full contents had reached the war council gathered in the castle's great hall. Drake requested a formal meeting, to be held at the border of the outer settlements, to discuss what he termed a matter of disputed inheritance that had recently come to his attention. He would arrive with only a small honor guard, and requested that Cain, along with the survivor whose existence had prompted this confrontation, do the same. "A trap," Garrick warned immediately. "He seeks to draw you both into the open with minimal protection." "Perhaps," Cain said, studying the message carefully. "Or perhaps he genuinely prefers negotiation to a war that could weaken his position with every other rival house watching his response closely. Either way, refusing his request risks appearing weak in front of exactly the houses we hope to eventually draw into alliance against him." Ren read the message herself, searching the careful, formal language for any hint of the man who had ordered her family's destruction so many years before, and found only the calculated caution of someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone currently gathered in this hall, exactly how much had changed since the fire that was supposed to have ended the Calder line forever. "I will go," she said quietly. "Whatever risk this meeting carries, I have hidden from this confrontation long enough. It is time Drake understood exactly what he failed to finish that night, and exactly what he now faces because of it." Cain took her hand, steady despite the danger gathering on the horizon, and nodded once, grim and resolute. "Then we face him together," he said, "as we have faced everything since the truth first found its way into the open." The following morning, as the sun rose over the tense, waiting kingdom, Cain and Ren rode out from the castle gates toward the border of the outer settlements, flanked by a small honor guard, and carrying between them the full weight of a confrontation, 2 years in the making, one that would finally determine whether the fire that destroyed the Calder house had truly ended anything at all, or merely delayed a reckoning that had always been destined to arrive. Drake waited beneath a simple canopy erected at the meeting point, a tall, broad man whose gray-streaked hair did nothing to diminish the sharp, calculating watchfulness in his eyes. He rose as Cain and Ren approached, studying the woman beside the king, with an intensity that made clear he had already guessed the truth before any introduction was offered. "So it is true," he said, once they had dismounted, and stood facing him across the short distance the negotiation demanded. "The fire did not finish what it was meant to. You have grown into quite a striking resemblance to your mother, though I confess, I did not expect to see that resemblance standing before me after all these years." "You remember my mother," Ren said, keeping her voice level, despite the fury tightening in her chest at his casual tone. "I remember many things about that night," Drake said, "including the considerable trouble her survival, and yours, now presents to arrangements I believed long settled." He gestured toward the canopy, inviting them to sit, though neither Cain nor Ren moved to accept the offer. "I will speak plainly, since I suspect neither of you have patience for lengthy diplomacy. Your survival threatens my hold over lands I have governed for 2 years without serious challenge. I am prepared to offer you a considerable sum, along with safe passage to any territory of your choosing, in exchange for a formal renunciation of any claim to those lands, made publicly, before witnesses who matter." "And if I refuse?" Ren asked. Drake's expression did not change, though something colder settled behind his eyes. "Then I will be forced to consider you a threat to the stability I have worked years to establish, and I will act accordingly, regardless of whatever protection this kingdom currently extends to you." "You are threatening war," Cain said, stepping forward slightly, his voice hard. "I am stating consequences," Drake corrected smoothly. "War benefits no one, least of all a kingdom already weakened by the withdrawal of Lord Vane's forces. I would think carefully, Your Majesty, before allowing sentiment to outweigh the practical safety of everyone within your walls." Ren studied him for a long moment. Memory and fury, and 2 years of careful survival, all warring together beneath her carefully composed exterior. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the fear that might once have accompanied such a confrontation. "You destroyed my family believing it would end a bloodline that stood in your way. You were wrong then, and you are wrong now if you believe a sum of gold and safe passage will convince me to surrender what remains of my mother's legacy without a fight. I did not survive that fire to renounce my family's name, simply because it proves inconvenient for your ambitions." Drake's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed exterior since the meeting began. "Careful, girl. You may believe this kingdom's support makes you untouchable, but alliances built on sudden sympathy rarely survive the pressure of genuine conflict." "Perhaps," Cain said, stepping fully beside Ren now, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king who had already weighed every consequence. "Or perhaps you will find that this particular alliance was never built on sympathy alone, but on the simple recognition that a stolen legacy deserves to be reclaimed, whatever resistance that reclamation invites. Consider carefully, Drake, whether the houses currently watching this confrontation from a distance will rally behind your continued expansion, or behind a rightful heir finally standing to reclaim what was taken from her." The threat hung in the air, deliberate and unmistakable, and for the first time since the meeting began, uncertainty flickered across Drake's calculating expression. He studied both of them for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he had arrived with, before finally inclining his head slightly, a gesture that carried no genuine respect but acknowledged, at least, that the negotiation had not gone as simply as he had hoped. "Then it seems we have reached an impasse," he said. "I will withdraw for now, to consider my options more carefully. But do not mistake this pause for surrender, Your Majesty. I did not build my territory through patience alone, and I will not lose it through simple sentiment either." He turned and departed without further ceremony, his honor guard falling into formation behind him as the column began its slow retreat back toward the distant hills, and Ren watched him go with a fierce, unfamiliar satisfaction, settling over the fear that had governed her for so long. "That was not a resolution," Cain said quietly, watching the retreating banners alongside her. "No," Ren agreed, "but it was a beginning. He did not expect resistance, and now he must consider it seriously for the first time in 2 years. Whatever comes next, At least he no longer believes the Calder line simply erased and forgotten. They rode back toward the castle in the fading afternoon light, the immediate danger deferred rather than resolved, but carrying with them the first genuine sense that the balance long tilted entirely in Drake's favor had finally, however slightly, begun to shift. 3 neighboring houses answered the call for alliance within a week of Drake's withdrawal, their sealed letters arriving one after another with a swiftness that surprised even Edmund, whose careful strategy had first predicted their possible support. Each letter carried some variation of the same sentiment, old grievances against Drake's expansion finally given legitimate cause to act, now that a surviving heir offered the political justification these houses had lacked for years. Lord Pharaoh of the Eastern Territories, whose lands bordered Drake's own, and had suffered smaller incursions for a decade without sufficient cause to retaliate openly, pledged both soldiers and supplies. Lady Ashdown, whose family had once maintained close ties with the Calder house before its destruction, offered not only military support, but personal testimony to the legitimacy of Ren's claim, having known Ren's mother personally in years past. "This changes everything," Garrick admitted, reviewing the gathered pledges with an expression considerably softened from the hostility he had carried only weeks before. "With these forces combined with our own, we no longer face Drake from a position of weakness. We may, in fact, hold the advantage should this come to open conflict." "Then perhaps it will not need to," Ren said, studying the letters spread across the council table. "Drake built his territory through calculated conquest, not blind aggression. If he sees clearly that the balance has shifted against him, he may reconsider the cost of continued resistance, rather than risk losing everything in a war he cannot win." Kane watched her across the table, pride and something deeper settling warm in his chest, as he observed the quiet, steady authority she now carried, so different from the frightened stable hand who had once flinched from unexpected shadows, and yet unmistakably the same person, the same careful intelligence and quiet resilience that had first drawn him to that stable so many months before. The following weeks passed in careful diplomatic maneuvering, messengers traveling between the newly formed alliance and Drake's territory, each side testing the other's resolve without committing fully to open war. Word eventually reached the castle that Drake, faced with the mounting alliance now arrayed against him, and the very real possibility of losing considerably more than the Calder lands he had originally sought to protect, had begun quietly reaching out to broker terms, rather than risk the devastating conflict that open war would bring. The final negotiation took place not at some tense border meeting, but within the great hall of Kane's own castle, where Drake arrived with considerably less confidence than he had carried during their first confrontation, flanked by advisors rather than soldiers, prepared now to discuss terms rather than dictate them. "I am prepared to relinquish formal claim to the Calder territories," Drake said, addressing the assembled council and the alliance representatives who had gathered to witness the proceedings, "in exchange for guarantees regarding my own remaining holdings, and assurance that this matter will be considered fully resolved, without further claims against me, for the events of 2 years past." Ren stood at the center of the hall, no longer disguised, no longer hidden, dressed now in colors that echoed the Calder crest she had once kept folded away in secret, hidden beneath a stable loft mattress. She studied Drake for a long moment before responding, weighing the satisfaction of demanding harsher terms against the practical wisdom of securing peace, without prolonging a conflict that would cost lives on both sides, regardless of who ultimately prevailed. "I will accept the return of my family's lands," she said finally, "and I will not pursue further claims against your remaining territory, provided you formally acknowledge, before all houses gathered here, the truth of what happened that night, and provided you make appropriate restitution to the families who lost everything alongside mine, whose names history has too easily forgotten in the shadow of my own survival." Drake's expression tightened at the demand, clearly having hoped to escape the confrontation without formal acknowledgement of the atrocity he had ordered. But the alliance arrayed against him left little room for further negotiation. He inclined his head slowly, the gesture carrying genuine weight this time, rather than the calculated dismissal of their first meeting. "I accept these terms," he said, the words clearly costing him considerable pride to speak aloud. The formal acknowledgement that followed, delivered before the assembled houses, and recorded by scribes whose careful documentation would ensure the truth survived beyond this single gathering, brought a quiet, unexpected release, to something Wren had carried since the night her mother's hand had released hers and pushed her toward survival alone. It was not full justice, not the return of everything the fire had taken, but it was acknowledgement, finally, after 2 years of enforced silence and erasure, and it mattered more than she had expected it to. In the months that followed, the reclaimed Calder territories began the slow process of rebuilding under Wren's careful governance, supported by the alliance that had rallied to her cause, and by resources Kane's kingdom provided freely, without expectation of return, beyond the continued friendship between their two houses. Wren split her time between overseeing that rebuilding and remaining close to Kane's own kingdom, the bond between them having grown, across months of shared danger and quiet trust, into something neither of them any longer questioned or hesitated to acknowledge openly. Garrick, true to his cautious nature, remained watchful of the alliance for months afterward, though his suspicion had gradually transformed into genuine respect as he witnessed Wren's steady, careful leadership firsthand during joint council sessions between the two territories. "I confess I misjudged you," he told her once, during a planning session concerning shared border patrols. "I believed you a danger to my king's judgment. I did not expect to find, instead, someone whose judgment often exceeded his own." "I will take that as the closest thing to a compliment you are capable of giving," Wren said, and Garrick's rare, reluctant smile confirmed she had read him correctly. Edmund, for his part, had grown into something like an unofficial advisor to the rebuilding effort, traveling frequently between the two territories to help establish the administrative structures the Calder lands required after 2 years of Drake's occupation. It was during one such visit that he found Colin, the stable boy who had once mended clothes and offered quiet friendship during Wren's loneliest year, now serving as a messenger between the two households, having requested the position himself, once word spread that Wren intended to maintain close ties with the stables that had once sheltered her. "Strange, is it not?" Colin said to Edmund one afternoon, watching riders move between the two castles along the newly repaired road connecting their territories. "How quickly everything changed, once the truth finally stopped hiding." "Strange," Edmund agreed, "and yet somehow, in hindsight, entirely inevitable. Some truths, I have come to believe, cannot remain buried forever, however carefully they are hidden. They simply wait for the right moment, and the right people, to finally set them free." Iris, too, found her place gradually within the reshaped alliance, her early offer to remain as an advisor, slowly earning back the trust her earlier scheme had cost her. She proved, in time, a shrewd negotiator, between the various houses now bound together against Drake's remaining ambitions, her sharp political instincts finding purpose in service rather than personal advancement. She and Wren never became close friends, the wound of that public exposure too significant to fully heal into easy warmth, but a careful, professional respect grew between them nonetheless, forged through the shared understanding that both had, in their own ways, chosen difficult paths toward what ultimately proved to be the right outcome. On a quiet afternoon several months before the coronation, Wren returned for the first time to the site of her family's destroyed stronghold, standing now overgrown with wildflowers, where the eastern tower had once burned so fiercely against the night sky. Kane accompanied her, saying little, understanding instinctively that some grief required witness rather than words. She knelt at what remained of the old courtyard, running her fingers over blackened stone finally softened by 2 years of rain and returning grass, and allowed herself, for the first time since that terrible night, to properly mourn rather than simply survive. "I used to imagine this place rebuilt exactly as it was," she said quietly, "every stone restored, every room exactly as I remembered it. I do not want that anymore. I do not think I could bear living among ghosts of what was lost. I want to build something new here, something that honors what my family stood for, without pretending the fire never happened." "Then that is what we will build," Kane said simply, kneeling beside her among the wildflowers. "Something new, rooted in what came before, but not bound entirely by it." They stayed until the sun began to set behind the distant hills, and when they finally rode back toward the castle, Wren carried with her a lightness that had been missing since the very first night she arrived at the Ashworth stables, exhausted and hiding, and uncertain whether survival alone could ever feel like enough. It felt, for the first time, like enough was finally within reach. The coronation, when it finally came, took place on a bright autumn morning, nearly a year after the fire that had first driven Wren into hiding within these very walls. The great hall that had once witnessed her humiliating exposure, now filled instead with representatives from every allied house, gathered to witness a very different kind of revelation. The formal union between the Ashworth and Calder houses, sealed not through political convenience or forced alliance, but through a partnership built on genuine trust, tested by fire and danger, and 2 years of careful survival, that had finally found its resolution. Kane stood before the assembled hall, Wren beside him dressed in the deep blue of the Calder crest interwoven now with the colors of his own house, and spoke words that carried none of the careful political calculation that had once governed every choice within these walls. 2 years ago, this kingdom failed to prevent the destruction of a house that deserved protection rather than abandonment, he said, addressing the gathered nobles with quiet, unwavering conviction. Today, we correct that failure, not through simple restitution alone, but through genuine partnership, freely chosen, between 2 houses who understand now what true loyalty demands of those who hold power. Wren stepped forward, no longer the frightened survivor who had once hidden every trace of her true self behind careful disguise, but a woman who had reclaimed not only her family's lands, but her own name, spoken now without fear, before every witness gathered in that hall. "I am Elira Calder," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. "Daughter of a house believed destroyed, survivor of a fire meant to erase my family's name from history entirely. I stand before you today not as a hidden stable hand, nor as a frightened refugee seeking shelter, but as the rightful heir to lands reclaimed through alliance and courage rather than surrender, and as partner to a king who chose protection over convenience, when it would have been far easier to choose otherwise." The hall erupted into applause that echoed off the same stone walls that had witnessed her exposure months before, and as Kane took her hand before the assembled witnesses, sealing a union built on genuine partnership rather than political necessity, Wren felt the last remaining weight of 2 years of hidden fear finally lift away entirely, replaced by something she had not allowed herself to imagine possible since the night the fire first took everything she had known. Home. Not the stable loft where she had hidden for nearly a year, and not even the reclaimed Calder lands now slowly rebuilding under her careful governance, but this, standing beside someone who had chosen her, fully and without hesitation, from the very first moment the truth had finally come to light. The kingdom that had once wondered why its Alpha King kept vanishing from his own war meetings now understood completely, and as the celebration continued long into the autumn evening, filling the great hall with laughter and music rather than suspicion and fear, Elira Calder stood at the center of it all, no longer hiding, no longer running, finally and fully home.